And we're going to begin looking at verses 23 to the end of the chapter there. Primarily to get to the last part of that, we talked about last week and left it at that point. But to look at those few verses, chapter 2, verses 23 through 25. Now it happened in the process of time that the king of Egypt died. Then the children of Israel groaned because of the bondage. And they cried out, and their cry came up to God because of the bondage. So God heard their groaning, and God remembered His covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And God looked upon the children of Israel, and God acknowledged them. Talked about that. It says, and God remembered His covenant that He'd made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so we raised the question, does that mean that God had forgotten about that? And now suddenly it's been brought to His attention again, and He's just now remembered it? What did it mean when it said God had forgotten? Or He remembered, rather, that covenant? Does it mean that He's forgotten it? Nobody has? Yeah. And you look at it, you know, there's different ways of understanding this. But one of the things about it, and I've got a verse or two up here to kind of look at about this idea about God remembering. For instance, in Lamentations chapter 5, or 5:20, it says, why do you forget us forever and forsake us for so long a time? This is the time when Jeremiah's writing, Jerusalem has been destroyed. And the kingdom of Judah, the southern kingdom, has been carried away into Babylonian captivity. And so here's the cry going out from Jeremiah. And the question to God is, why do you forget us forever and forsake us for so long a time? The thing about this statement here is, this is poetic language that's being used, and it's a type of poetry that's referred to as parallelism. You'll find that a lot of times in the poetic books of the Bible. And by that, we simply mean that the writer states something in that first phrase, then he repeats the very same thing in the next phrase, but he uses different words to talk about it. And so, and he says, why do you forget us forever? That's the same thing as when he says, and forsake us for so long a time. So when it says, why do you forget us forever? What does it mean to forget? Had God forgotten about Israel and said, oh, who are these people? And in what sense did He forget them? Well, the next verse explains that, the parallel of that. Why do you forget us forever and forsake us for so long a time? So He hasn't forgotten them in the sense that He just doesn't remember anything about them, what's going on, but it's the fact that He's forsaken them. Because they have forsaken God, they're not living for God the way they should, then God's forsaken them. But in the poetic language, why, it says, do you forget us forever? And He hasn't forgotten them forever. He hasn't forsaken them forever. They're going to be 70 years in captivity before God is going to bring them back to their land. And so He hasn't forgotten them forever. He hasn't forsaken them forever, but He's forsaken them for a long time. There'll be a long period there before God will come back to them. And you see the same thing a lot of times in the prophets. Hosea 4:6. The first part of that we're very familiar with. My people are destroyed for a lack of knowledge. But these next two phrases, again, it's an idea of parallelism. It says, because we have rejected knowledge, because you have rejected knowledge, I also will reject you from being my priest for me. That's God talking to them. Then the next statements, He's saying the same thing. Because you have forgotten the law of your God, I also will forget your children. Well, those Jews had not forgotten the law of God, as if they didn't know what it was, or they didn't have copies of it, or anything of that nature. But it's explained in that first phrase, because you have rejected knowledge. They've got God's Word. They know, but they've just chosen not to follow it. So they've rejected His Word. And then also, because you have forgotten the law of your God. Well, that simply means they just rejected it. And because it says, I will reject you from being my priest, God says, I will forget your children. He is not forgetting their children, but He's just rejecting them. That they're not going to be His priest. They're not going to be serving Him in that period of time. So, whenever the Bible talks about things like that here, it says that God remembered. That doesn't mean that God had forgotten them. It's just that this time has come when God is going to start acting again. He had made the promise long ago to Abraham. He told Abraham, not only has He made those promises to them about having a land, a multitude of descendants, and the Messiah coming through him, but He had also said to Abraham back then that his people, his descendants, would be taken down and would go down into Egypt, and they would be enslaved there for 400 years. And then God says, I'll bring them back. And so He hasn't forgotten them in the sense that it says He remembered that promise to Abraham. But it's simply that it's just been a long time that God has waited before He's going to bring about the promise that He made to be able to bring them back to their land and all these promises be given to them. And so that's the idea here when it talks about when God remembered. He hadn't forgotten. He's just postponed what He had promised to do to them until the right time would come. There's an expression, there's a buildup of expressions in this to show that God really knows and cares about His people. He hasn't forgotten them. You look at the words that He says in regard to that. Look at verse 24 especially. Verse 24 says, and God heard their groaning. So He hasn't forgotten. He heard them. And they've been groaning ever since they've been in captivity, been enslaved there. And He's heard them. And God remembered His covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So He's heard them, and He's remembered the promises that He made. He's not forgotten them. And God saw the people. He's not only heard their groaning, but He has seen what they're going through in their enslavement and what it's been like for them. And God knew their condition. He knew exactly what was happening to them and how they were suffering. So He hasn't forgotten. It's a build-up being shown here to the Jews so they will understand how much God knows and cares for them. And God is getting ready to act. Because of their groanings, He's heard them, and He's going to see to it that they're going to be delivered. And so everything we're going to be looking at now in chapter 3 is the beginning of this process of God beginning His plan, to initiate His plans to deliver them. But it all begins with this man Moses and the call of Moses. And so in chapter 3, verse 1, and going through chapter 4 and verse 31, you're going to be talking about the call of God to Moses and of Moses' response to it. And we're going to begin just looking at the first 6 verses here of chapter 3, the call at the burning bush. And this is one of the intriguing things about it. Chapter 3, verse 1, beginning and going through 6, says, now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And he led his flock to the back of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire from the midst of a bush. So he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, but the bush was not consumed. Then Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush does not burn. So when the Lord saw that he turned aside to look, God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Do not draw near this place. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place where you stand is holy ground. Moreover, he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. And so here, the initiating of this, of God's call to him on this occasion. It begins by telling us that Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. Now, who is this Jethro? I thought his father-in-law was Ruel. That's the way he's introduced to us initially. When Moses flees and comes down to the land of Midian, beginning there in chapter 2, verse 16. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water and filled the troughs of water for their father's flocks. The shepherds came and drove them away, and Moses stood up and helped them and watered their flocks. When they came to their father, Ruel, he said, How is it that you've come home so soon? Ruel. He is called the father of Moses, the father-in-law of Moses, but here he's called Jethro. So is this a mistake that Moses has made or somebody's made and getting the name wrong? There are two possibilities as how to explain this. Steve, you want to say something? In all likelihood, I believe that's the thing. I believe that's another name. Not really a name, but a title. We said Ruel meant friend of God. Jethro means eminence. And so it's a possibility that was just a title that he had, that he's given. You see that even in our world today. In the Catholic Church, what is the cardinal called? If you're speaking to the cardinal, what do you call him? His Eminence. If you write a letter to him, you're supposed to write His Eminence. Well, that's not his name, that's a title he has. And it may be that Jethro, meaning His Eminence, that's just a title he has. His name is Ruel, but he's referred to here as His Eminence. He is Jethro. So that could be a possibility. Another possibility that has been used, it was interesting reading some of the different commentaries about this. Adam Clark, for example, said that this word son-in-law that's used is really a word, all it does is expresses a relationship that you have through marriage. And so it could be, that same word could be used to talk about son-in-law, a brother-in-law, a father-in-law, or whatever. And so here it's translated father-in-law, but he says it could just as well have been translated son-in-law. And so what he said would be was that Ruel maybe has died and his son, Jethro, has taken over as priest of Midian. And Jethro, being a son of Ruel, means he's also the brother of Zipporah. So that means he would be the brother-in-law to Moses. And so when it says Jethro, father-in-law, it could be that it should have been Jethro, the brother-in-law of Moses. Well, that's a possibility. But I've never found any translation that chooses to translate here brother-in-law instead of father-in-law. And so I just tend to think more of the first idea, that Jethro is just a title meaning His Eminence, and his real name is Ruel. So anyhow, that's the reason why we have the difference here in the name. So Moses is there in this work, and what Moses is doing is he's keeping the flock for his father-in-law. Now, we mentioned this number before. How long does Moses spend in the land of Midian? 40 years. So he goes there and he becomes a shepherd of the flock of Ruel. And so for 40 years, he's going to be working there as a shepherd. And so that's the idea being expressed here, and I believe that's of great importance for us to understand about that, that he is serving as a shepherd. And during that time, Moses is going to be learning some things. He's already tried once to deliver God's people, and how did that work out? It didn't. He tried to stop an Egyptian from beating a Jew, and he killed the Egyptian. Then when he realized, he hid the body, and then when he realized that others knew about it, he became frightened, and he fled to the land of Midian. Well, God's going to use him. God chooses him to be the deliverer, but God doesn't choose him immediately to do that. It's going to take a while for Moses, I think, to grow, and where he's in that position that he's ready to lead those people. And so for 40 years he's being trained, and his training comes in the form of being a shepherd. And I know you probably have read about different things about that in Psalms 23, about the shepherd and what a shepherd is like. And I think that in being a shepherd over that period of time, Moses is going to learn some things that will be of value to him when he has to lead God's people. When you think about it, first of all, Moses has been there for 40 years doing that, so he's got a lot of time to learn this. Now, learn number one, sheep need to be led, not driven. Moses, I think, tried to will himself upon the people to do what he wants them to do. And he thinks they ought to understand that, but they don't. Well, after being 40 years as a shepherd of sheep, he begins to learn, hey, if you're a shepherd with sheep, you've got to learn to lead them, not drive them. And so that's going to be one of the things he's going to have to put up with. Different passages on this. Look at John chapter 10 for just a moment. We're going to look at a couple of verses there. But John 10 in the New Testament, where Jesus is talking about himself as being the good shepherd. Look at first of all, verse 3. Who's got that verse can read that for us, please? Okay, Darnell, I know I can depend on you.
To him the gatekeeper opens. The sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out.
Okay, and he leads them out. That's what the good shepherd does. Now, the very next verse there, he goes on, Jesus says, my sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me. So he leads, and they follow. And so Moses is going to have to understand that when he goes down to Egypt, he's not going to be able to command them and point the way. He's going to have to lead them. And if he leads properly, as a man of God, he'll be able to have them to follow him and know that. David said in Psalms 23:3, he leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. He's talking about the good shepherd. He's talking about God, and that's what God does. He leads us. And so that's what Moses has to learn to do that. Something else that he needed to learn about sheep is that sheep need to be fed. Now, probably Moses, when he first, killed that Egyptian to prevent him from killing a Jew that he was beating, and he thought, hey, the people ought to understand that I'm the one that's going to deliver them. I wonder if he ever even thought about logistics. That's one of the things that Brother Brown Rogers and I used to talk about. I've watched a lot of the different shows about World War II, just not just movies about it, but history things about it. And you never really talk much about logistics, but all that's needed to supply that army. And that's a tremendous job. And it takes a lot of planning, a lot of work goes into it. So I wondered if Moses ever thought, okay, we've got 600,000 men here of military age, and they've got their wives and their children. So maybe we've got 2.5 to 3 million people, and I'm going to lead them out of Egypt to the Promised Land. Now, how am I going to go about feeding these people? You've got to have some kind of plan involved in that for it. And initially, I don't think he had any idea about it at all, didn't understand it. But sheep, as a shepherd, he knows, hey, in leading them, I've got to be able to provide food for them. I've got to lead them to where they need to be. Now, we kind of talked about this a little bit on the mount that we showed last week. The land of Midian is considered to be to the east of the Gulf of Aqaba. And that's where the Midianites lived. But where he is going to lead them on the far side of the desert is going to be several miles away if he's coming from there. But he's going there to find pasture for them, a place for them to feed. Again, several different verses in regard to this. Come on now. John 21:15. So when they had eaten breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me more than these? He said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. He said to him, feed my lambs. Now, Peter is an apostle, but there's another position of honor and responsibility that he has. Whether or not at this time, but later he has. What's that? He becomes a shepherd. He becomes an elder of the church. And he writes about that to encourage those who, like him, are elders. 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 1 through 4. The elders who are among you, I exhort. I, who am also a fellow elder and witness of the sufferings of Christ, and also a partaker of the glory that will be revealed. Shepherd the flock of God which is among you, serving as overseers, not by compulsion, but willingly, not for dishonest gain, but eagerly, not as being lords over those entrusted to you, but being examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the crown of glory that does not fade away. Now that's the New King James Version. Does anybody have a translation a little bit different from this there on verse 2? I think the King James translates the word. The word shepherd is, it's not a noun though, this is the verb form of it. Does anybody have a King James? Feed the flock of God. That's what He's commanded to do. Poimeno is the word for elder or shepherd, but the verb form of it means to feed. That's a responsibility that a shepherd has. And so Moses has to learn, with that flock of sheep he's got, that he's got to take them where there is food to be provided for them. And so they've got to be fed. He learns it. And so with these Jews, when you bring them out of the land of Egypt, you're going to lead them then to the promised land. There's got to be some way of preparing food for them. Now, he's got the support of God that's going to take care of that. But he's got to realize that there is a responsibility there for that. Now, also, sheep need to be protected. There are a lot of enemies that sheep have. I'm talking about the animal sheep. David talked about it. He talked about the time that the bear and the lion would take a sheep from him, and David would destroy that animal to save the sheep. He had that sling that he could use, and he was able to kill, whether it was a bear or a lion. He was able to kill them and save the sheep. That's something that needs to be done. Psalms 23 and verse 4. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Now that rod was more of a weapon. It was a short piece of wood, usually getting larger toward the end, but it was used as a club that they could use to ward off any enemies. The staff that he talks about was more like the crook staff you normally associate with the shepherd, but that was something to be used if a sheep's going astray or he's gone down in the ditch. You can use that to pull him out. And so a shepherd has that responsibility of taking care of sheep by protecting them in those times. And so that's one of the things that Moses got to learn about protecting them, because out in that wilderness, there's a lot of dangers to them. And it's not always dangers from animals or men. It's the dangers they have within themselves when they begin thinking about, how good it was back in Egypt. And they start talking about going back to Egypt. And why in the world would anybody want to go back to a place of slavery where they were abused the way they were, and they had to labor 24/7? And so those things are going to come up. And Moses has got to know how to protect them from that. And you're going to see that he does that. Also, the shepherd, not only in protecting them, the shepherd must be willing to die for the sheep. And again, different verses on that. John chapter 10 again, Jesus talks about himself as being the good shepherd. And at verse 11, Jesus said, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd gives his life for the sheep. And so Moses needs to learn something about being a shepherd. You've got to be willing to die for the sheep. You think Moses was willing to die for Israel? Yeah. There's some passages here, if I can get this correct. 3 verses here in Exodus 32. First of all, verse 10. God speaks now to Moses, and God says, Therefore let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and that I may consume them, and I will make of you a great nation. All right, Moses, I'm tired of the murmuring and complaining constantly of the Jews. Just let my anger alone, and I'm going to destroy them. And Moses, I'll take you, and I'll make a great nation out of you. Now, several things go on before Moses returns. He goes to the people and talks with them about what's happened. They've committed a great sin in making that golden calf and worshiping it. But then he goes back to God to talk to God about it. So verse 31 and 32. Then Moses returned to the Lord and said, "Oh, these people have committed a great sin and have made for themselves a god of gold. Yet now, if you," that's God, "if you will forgive their sin, but if not, I pray, blot me out of your book which you have written." Moses is willing to die. Blot me out of that book that you've got, that book of life that you have. And so he's pleading with God that God might forgive Israel. But if not, then Moses said, blot me out of that book too. Let me die with them. He had that willingness. He had that kind of love for them. I think about the Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 9. Paul willing that himself to be cut off from Christ if it would mean the salvation of his brethren, the Jews. Of course, that was not possible, but he was willing, and he makes that statement, willing to do it. The love that the shepherd has for the sheep, that he'd be willing to do that. And so Moses needs to understand about these things before he's really going to be able to serve as the kind of man that God can use to bring Jews out of Egypt and bring them up to that land that God had promised. So Moses led the sheep to the backside of the desert and came to Horeb. That's interesting to me. Where did he meet God? Out on the backside of the desert. He goes there to meet God. He doesn't realize it, but that's where he's going to meet God. He learned about God from his mother down in Egypt, but he had not met him. He learned maybe some things about God from Ruel and others there, but he hadn't met God. But he met him out on the backside of the desert. If you think about a desert, what do you think about? Yeah, a place that's desolate, and nobody there, and no plant growth or anything. And you think, if you want to go meet God, you probably wouldn't think that's where you need to go. Go off to a desolate place to meet Him. People today who want to meet God, where do you think they go today? Sometimes we think of our own life, say, if God's going to use me, if I want God to use me, I need to go where God is to meet Him. And we go to meet God in His Word. That's where we find out about God. And we can meet God in our prayers to God to know Him and to let God know that we're willing to be used by Him in any way that He sees fit. But most people look for God in places of great, glorious things, beautiful things, a beautiful structure. And I think about things like St. Peter's Basilica and what that's like, that thing is beautiful, and it's large, and it's wealthy. And a lot of people think, man, that's where you'd find the King of Kings. But Moses found him on the far side of the desert. God can be found, but we need to be the ones to look for Him, to find Him where He's at, and not where we think He should be. So anyhow, he goes to the far side of the desert, and he comes to Horeb. Now, what is Horeb? It's called the mountain of God, but what else? What's the other name for it? Sinai. And that's interesting. I see these things, but I don't ever find anybody explaining why they believe this. But again, you look at on that map, you got the Sinai Peninsula, and you got the Gulf of Aqaba over here, and on this side where the Midians are at. There are some people say this is where Mount Horeb, Mount Sinai is at. And every map that I'd ever seen before, and all the classes I ever had, Sinai Peninsula. And that's where Mount Sinai is at. I don't understand. Maybe it's because they say, well, Mount Horeb's over here, but Mount Sinai's over here. No. Horeb is just another name for Mount Sinai that they have. And it's called Horeb there. Here's a kind of hard to see on this. But it's circled there, Mount Sinai, and then down below it in parentheses it says Horeb. Other people think it ought to be placed over here. Can't get that to see on there good. Where Midian is at. And they put it down here somewhere. But whatever it is, Mount Sinai, Mount Horeb, it's the same thing. But that word Horeb that's used there for this mountain. Does anybody have a footnote or something on that about Mount Horeb? I had that in one of mine. I don't know if that's on this one or not. No, it doesn't have it. But that's again, it's a desert place, but it's called the Mount of God, or the Mountain of God. Probably, this name is a name that Moses gave to it. Not at that time, but later, after Moses at Sinai meets God. After he goes up on Mount Sinai and receives the Ten Commandments. So that's when he would name it the Mountain of God. But later, as he writes the book here of Exodus, he identifies this mountain back here as the Mount of God. So it's a place where he's met God. It's where God has appeared to him. And that's why he calls it this Mount of God there. But also here, the angel of the Lord appeared to Moses in a burning bush. Now this is something that's interesting too. And I went a long, long time before I heard anything about this explanation of people about it. But who is this angel of the Lord? And every time it's used, I believe it's used, it always has the angel of the Lord. Now, a lot of people believe it's a manifestation of God himself in that way. And there's reasons to believe that. If you're looking at it there, in chapter 3, this is where all of this is involved. Verse 2, it's the first time it says, "And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flame and fire out of the midst of a bush." Then you come on down, it says, when the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, "Moses, Moses." And he said, "Here am I." Then you come on down to verse 6. This angel of the Lord appears to him in the burning bush, is talking to him. And look at verse 6. "And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." So that identifies, I think, who this angel of the Lord is. The angel of the Lord is talking to Moses, and he says to Moses, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." So it's not an angel. It's not even an archangel. It's God himself manifesting himself here as an angel in appearance there to Moses. And there's several times in the Bible where you'll read something like that. And he appears to him and talks to him out of a burning bush. And I think that's significant. There are a lot of reasons, why the burning bush might have been used. Certainly one of the reasons why that burning bush is used is because it catches Moses' attention. And I think anybody seeing something like that, their curiosity would get them. Here's a bush, it's on fire, but it's not consumed. It's not like anything else you've seen burn, catch on fire and it burns up, and soon there's nothing there but ashes. This doesn't do that. It just keeps burning. And that's when Moses says, "I will turn aside to see this." Because he was concerned, curious to know, why is it burning but it's not burned up? And so when he turns aside to see and God sees that, then God speaks to him out of the burning bush. But there's so many times when God speaks to people, manifests himself to people, it's usually in some form of fire. Back when God made his covenant with Abraham, he told Abraham to take an heifer, a female goat, and what else was it? A lamb. 3 animals, plus take a turtle dove and a pigeon. And the 3 animals, he's told, kill them and cut them in 2 and set the sides apart, facing each other. You do that with each of those animals. And then God causes a smoking pot and a flaming torch to pass between those 2 pieces. And then evidently Abraham passes between the 2. And the idea of such a covenant is, if I am not faithful to this covenant, let me become like one of these animals. Let me be destroyed. Let me be divided in 2. But God goes through in the appearance of a smoking pot and a flaming torch. And then you can think of any other time when God ever manifested Himself in some way like that. When He led the people out of Egypt. A pillar of cloud by day, a pillar of fire by night. But the thing of it is that flaming torch, God oftentimes uses fire in His appearance to people. And so here, the burning bush, God uses that to get the attention of Moses. Then He speaks to him out of that bush. And one of the first things that He says to him is, do not come near. Why? Do what? Yeah, because He says where you stand is holy ground. And He also tells him to take his sandals off. That was a way of honoring. Whenever a person went into a place, whether it was some type of cathedral or whatever for the worship, that they would, in honor of that deity, would take their shoes off. There are a lot of customs like that in the world even today. I remember when Don and I went to Saipan, when you went into everybody's home, you took your shoes off. You didn't go into the house. I don't know if that was just, it wasn't just, to keep them tracking dirt in or anything like that, but it was just a way of respect to the people of that home that you did that. Well, in respect of God, this is a holy place, so Moses, you take your sandals off because where you're standing is holy ground. Now, what made that ground holy? The presence of God. Now, when God is through using that burning bush to talk to Moses and He leaves, that ground's no longer holy. It's holy only because God is there. That's what makes it holy. That ground has not been consecrated by some priest or anything like that. It's the fact that God's there. Wherever God is, it's holy ground. And so, when He's there, it's holy ground. And so, tells Moses, don't come near, take off your sandals, for the ground on which you're standing is holy ground. But interesting, when he calls Moses, he says, Moses, Moses. Why did He repeat his name? Maybe to make sure He got his attention. Also, maybe some have suggested to emphasize, the importance of this event and of what's going to be said to you. Do you know of any other times in the Bible when God ever spoke to somebody and repeated their name? Saul of Tarsus, on the road to Damascus to find any Christians to arrest them and bring them bound to Jerusalem. And Christ appears to him, and what did He say? Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? A young boy by the name of Samuel had been lent by his mother to the service of God, and when he is weaned, she takes him there to the temple to be with Eli and to serve him. And one night, when Samuel, this young boy, is asleep, and he hears a voice calling, Samuel, Samuel. And Samuel got up and went running to Eli. Thought, here I am. Well, it wasn't Eli calling, it was God. And so after the 3rd time, and Eli realized it, he tells him, you go back, and when you hear that voice, you say, speak, Lord, your servant hears. Well, that's what's happening here. Moses, Moses. And he says, who art thou, Lord? And God tells him. And he says, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Two things about that very quickly because our time's gone. We'll talk more about it next week. Number one, that's the very passage that Jesus quoted in his argument against the Sadducees who didn't believe in a resurrection. Number two, in regard to that, Moses, Moses, who art thou, Lord? When he said, who art thou, Lord, what was he asking? What did he want to know? All right, we'll talk about that next week. Our time's gone, so we'll leave it at that point. Let's have a word of prayer and we'll be dismissed. Father, we're grateful again that we've had this time to be together, and we pray, Father, you would bless us in our efforts in studying your word to come to a clear knowledge of what you are wanting us to know and to understand, and to know and understand properly how we ought to apply it into our own lives. Help us, Father, to be strong in this life and service to Thee. Dismiss us now in your care and keep us safe and bring us back again this Sunday. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.